Today, we're very pleased to have with us Lauren Kahn. Lauren is a research fellow at the Council on Economic Relations, where her work focuses on defense innovation and the impact of emerging technologies on international security, with a particular emphasis on artificial intelligence. Prior to joining CFR, Lauren worked as a research fellow at Perry Worldhouse, the University of Pennsylvania's global policy think tank, where she helped launch and run its project on emerging technologies and global politics. And we are very glad to have her with us today. Lauren, whenever you're ready.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. So I know that I'm speaking to folks that are working on these issues, but I guess to kind of preface this conversation about, the political declaration, I want to give a bit of context on the idea for confidence building measures for artificial intelligence in the security sphere in general, and some of the risks that me and a few of my colleagues, including Mike Horowitz, have worked on and kind of devised as we're seeing the most prominent risks, and kind of give, again, a bit of context to this declaration. So again, thank you for having me. It's great to be here. So as militaries around the world are seeking to gain a strategic edge over their adversaries by integrating artificial intelligence and AI into their arsenals, we see, the use of AI on the battlefield in increasingly diverse contexts, especially in Ukraine. We're seeing the use of facial recognition technology to identify combatants. We're seeing it, AI algorithms being used in artillery targeting, natural language processing used to, intercept and, translate radio transmissions in real time, as well as tag them. So they're really, being used across the gambit. So again, but it's both in civilian and military sectors, which create risks across society. And so for the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to use the DoD definition, the Department of Defense definition of AI, as imperfect as it is, just so that we're all on the same page here. So according to the Department of Defense's strategy for artificial intelligence, it is considered the ability of machines to perform tasks that normally require human intelligence. So quite broad ranging. So that can take anything back from, Patriot missile guidance systems that were developed, in the 40s and 50s to anything that we see now today. So research has shown that many AI and machine learning communities are concerned about militaries can be trusted to develop safe and reliable AI. And in the current geopolitical context, there's a fear that competitive pressures in particular to deploy AI systems could lead to safety and ethics being overlooked. This could incentivize militaries to take shortcuts that increase, I would say, maybe three main strategic risks. One, the risk of lethal accidents. Two, the risk of unintentional conflict. And three, the risk of inadvertent escalation. And so these are applicable more broadly, as well as, in nuclear context, other contexts as well. So diving into the first, lethal accidents, this refers to instances where an AI-powered system causes harm or loss of life due to a malfunction or error. Some examples might be, in military application of AI may not work as intended due to flaws in the algorithms themselves, with issues such as inadequate training data, the algorithm's complexity, biased data, biased coding, or intentional data sabotage via poisoning or adversaries, and those can all make accidents more likely when systems are deployed. For example, the malfunctioning of an AI-enabled targeting system in a conflict could attack friends instead of foes, or friends and foes alike, or an algorithmic decision aid could derive a flawed estimate of the risk of a particular operational plan, leading to a use of force that either unnecessarily fails or succeeds at a greater cost than is required. And so these risks are amplified when systems are employed outside their design context, as AI is often brittle. So when it comes to unintentional conflict, this occurs when miscommunication or accidents between states lead to conflict. So even if algorithms work as designed, they could unintentionally make conflict more likely. So uncertainty about how algorithms will work on the battlefield could create challenges for signaling, in particular towards adversaries through postures and deployments in a crisis or within a conflict. So actors might be uncertain about how AI-enabled systems deployed by an adversary will behave, right? It's not necessarily observable what the algorithm is doing. So they might not believe that an AI-enabled autonomous systems are programmed as described because of this black box nature of some of these algorithms, and that could lead to increased skepticisms of claims made about the systems. And even if a state is telling the truth about a specific system and how it was used, there might not be a way for a third party or another state to validate or verify those claims in an observable way. And so the third risk is that of inadvertent escalation, which refers to intentional actions taken by states that unintentionally cause escalation by an adversary. And so there's still substantial uncertainty about the reliability of many AI methods, I would say, especially deep learning and related techniques when they generate, more opaque outputs, meaning there's not an available chain of logic, which explains why the algorithm recommended or engaged in a particular action. So even with sufficient training data, hedges against biases, and protections from data poisoning or hacking, current systems may not be prepared for testing and evaluation, validation, and verification, or TEVV, of algorithmic systems, particularly AI-enabled autonomous systems that will continually learn while operating. And so when you're operating at machine speed, AI-enabled autonomous systems could cause adversaries in a conflict to fear losing a war so quickly that they feel compelled to escalate. Or for an adversary, for example, with nuclear weapons, this could create pressure for launch postures, such as a pre-delegation and launch on warning, that increase the chance of nuclear use. So considering the potential risks associated with the use of AI in these military contexts that I've just outlined, it's easy to, I think, become overwhelmed by the thought of out of control robots taking over nuclear command and control systems and things like that. So I would like to shift again the focus to, I think, what is a more optimistic note and really the main focus of this talk, which is, given the newness of the technology and the widespread acknowledgement of its potential risk, I think everyone's on board with these risks and understand that they're worth, addressing. There's a pressing need for control and establishment of norms to ensure safe and ethical development and deployment of AI systems in military contexts. So again, recent events such as the situation in Ukraine have created what I think is a really conducive environment for confidence building measures aimed at addressing these risks. Such measures could increase transparency and accountability, or enhanced international cooperation and the development of common standards and guidelines for the use of AI in the military. And so the significant development in this field, though, is really that in February, the United States announced its political declaration on responsible military use of artificial intelligence and autonomy. It's a mouthful, but responsible AI declaration is what I'm going to refer to it from the rest of this talk. It announced it at the REAIM conference in the Netherlands, and it outlines essentially its commitment to the responsible military use of AI and autonomy. And so the U.S. further expressed its intention at this summit to collaborate with other states in the near future to voluntarily co-sign onto these principles, marking an important step, I think, towards international coordination on AI military context. This is really the first of its kind in that it's a state proposed document, but from the Defense Department. So it's binding for the Defense Department, and trying to get other states to co-sign on. So I'm really hopeful on that front. So the 12 principles include legal reviews of AI applications to ensure compliance with international humanitarian law, active transparent efforts to reduce bias in systems, create systems with auditable methodologies, data sources, design procedures, and documentation, as well as appropriate training for operators, and even assured human control and involvement in decisions of nuclear weapons employment. Although, again, non-binding for other states or states that signed on, this declaration, I think, will serve as a foundation for international cooperation in establishing guidelines for the use of AI in military operations. And the significance really lies in the fact that it covers not just autonomous weapon systems, but a broader range of AI applications that pose significant risks. I think the proactive initiative towards global governance and military AI is crucial in separating AI policies from those related to autonomy or lethal autonomous weapons, particularly as AI technology continues to evolve and its applications extend beyond weapons and uncrewed vehicles. I think a lot of the discussion has focused on lethal autonomous weapons, but a lot of the risks I outlined are not necessarily specifically for weapons systems themselves, but things like inherent bias that are baked into algorithms, or for logistics or planning, or things like predictive maintenance that might not seem necessarily lethal or as dangerous, but are still pose risks and can still create failure cascades. I think that not only is this a more realistic assessment of AI risk, but it opens the door to collaboration and consultation with a wider range of stakeholders that aren't traditionally thought of as defense actors, because their AI applications aren't, again, obviously lethal. So I think an example, and we can probably get into this in the Q&A, but OpenAI, Georgetown CSET, and Stanford Internet Observatory a while ago published an excellent report highlighting how generative large language models like ChatGPT are posing emerging threats when it comes to created automated influence operations, and are thinking about what kind of broader security implications these kind of models might have, and in the end, opening up to talking with states. And I think that collaboration is really important. Shared standards for safe uses of military AI could reduce the probability of accidents, I really think that standards help to herald market access, interoperability, and connectivity. And while they might appear technical, standards can permit really baking in of fundamental human rights protections when ethical AI principles are translated into these technical standards. I think in the long run as well, standardization will facilitate coordination between states and ease interoperability with allied systems as well, so that states can, collaborate more effectively, and that the risk of accidents there decreases as well. And so I'd like to highlight that while we're still at the dawn of the application of, machine learning and AI by militaries, and setting more rigid guides now may create limits that decrease stability or might not be appropriate later. So any agreement really needs to be flexible. And so I think the establishment of guidelines with the potential to expand as technologies necessarily evolve, and, circumstances kind of involving military's AI mature, I think it's really important to have these confidence building measures that avoid prematurely restricting states, but are essential given the early stages, that can kind of guide its development. And so moving on, whether will other states kind of sign this agreement? I know that when it was released, it was announced that the United States had spoken to a few other countries about this initiative already, which ones it wasn't clear, but that they received some positive feedback. But so far, as of today, it remains an American document. So the State Department and Pentagon are also hoping to attract backers beyond their usual partners, from what it seems like. I think Bonnie Jenkins and other State Department officials have mentioned that they would like to expand to go beyond the broader set of countries and begin getting international buy-in, not just NATO countries, but buy-in in Asia and from countries in Latin America and then around the world that are really kind of on the cutting edge developing AI, so that they understand the implications and development. So it's not just US friends and partners. And so in theory, a wider variety of states should sign on, not that it's just US allies and partners. And since I think that is pretty low risk, again, non-binding common sense norms, I think that, while there might be some hesitancy about adversaries and, maybe non-aligned states like China and Russia, I still think that they might have a good reason to sign on to standards that could commit to enhance military AI safety. In theory, they benefit all. And, neither country would like to be perceived as not following, I think, the international standards on military AI safety, because it could undermine support within their AI research communities and ability to keep those researchers. So I know I threw a lot at the group, but I'll stop there and I look forward to the discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Lauren. That was a great introduction to this topic. And so I think I have the opportunity to ask a few questions, and we can chat a little bit, and then we'll open up to the floor for further questions. So I think the first thing I wanted to ask is, the way you describe it, it doesn't sound like, anybody could object to any word in it. And in fact, it reads like that. But on the other hand, as you well know, many civil society groups have been objecting, like the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots is strenuously objecting. So I'm curious what you think about that. Do they have a point, or are they missing something?
Yeah, I think my point here is, again, that distinction. I think the really importance of separating the autonomy and the AI. I think when it comes to these issues, I think they, are very valid in the focus and concern about lethal autonomous weapons. However, from my perspective as someone working, on broader defense applications of AI, I think there are very present and pressing risks now. I think that we shouldn't, be saying that these are bad because they don't do enough. I think they're an initial first step and can really be a launching point for other kind of confidence building measures. That I think that's the essential kind of idea, that they're building blocks where you can add on and add on. I think trying to be super specific early on is not going to get a lot of buy-in, which, I think has been a problem of that kind of tack in the past. The United States, I don't think, is going to sign anything that will ban lethal autonomous weapons, regardless if they agree or not, for various reasons. And so I think having an initial set of guidelines and norm creation is valid, because it doesn't mean that those don't apply, but it also, again, broadens that scope to think about things like bias that are not necessarily, again, lethal autonomous weapons or killer robots, but are still very pressing and real issues, and should be considered and taken seriously.
Yeah, so the civil society groups, not so much having a point there, I guess. In the end, no, I can well appreciate the points you're making. Okay, that's interesting. So what I want to ask, I guess I'm curious so you said a little bit of this in your talk, but what does a win look like in this space, right? If we're looking a few months from now, and we're saying this has just gone as well as we can imagine it going, not in the realm of unreality, but in what we think is the realm of possibility, which are the states that have signed on, and what impacts do you think the declaration is having.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to see those that are really on the cutting edge of AI being signed on. I mean, really, really ambitiously, like absolute when I mean, it doesn't necessarily need to have China and Russia sign on, but I think if countries like Singapore and South Korea and Japan and in Latin America as well that are really kind of working on these issues, I think sign on beyond, again, the NATO countries and the typical allies and partners, I think will be a huge step forward and really open the avenue for other confidence building measures that can be more specific, something potentially like an autonomous incidents agreement that agrees upon, norms of behavior for uncrewed systems in the air and at sea. I think, that will create a fora and at least a ground kind of understanding for what's acceptable and trying to solve, I think, some of the technical issues that exist between, creating, testing and verification of AI systems. I mean, there's very lofty principles, right? They say they want to have auditable systems. I think that's a very noble goal and I think outlined, but what that looks like does not exist yet, right? It's unclear, what that will look like in practicality. So I think the next steps, I think ushering into some of the more working with the private sector to develop some kind of tractable technical solutions to some of these more political problems and issues like signaling. Are there avenues for watermarking or, ensuring that there's like zero proof ways to demonstrate what algorithms have done? I think will be like the really exciting next step that I'm looking at, but that's me being very, very ambitious.
Right, exactly. Okay, so just sort of following up on that, I want to ask a sort of I don't know, a question that maybe it's just a tiny bit cynical, but nevertheless, I'd be curious to know your take on it. So, a cynic might say, well, this is sort of posturing because if the U.S. really wanted to bring everybody along and create this common standard, most of that would happen behind closed doors. It would go to China and Russia maybe and say, hey, let's do this together. Let's come out and all have this together. But instead, it's very much US branded. So it's almost like, if a Democrat comes out and says, this is our plan, this is what we're doing, what are the Republicans doing? It almost has that flavor. And of course, then the Republicans have their hackles up and they have to do something different and propose their own plan and so on and so forth. So is that cynicism warranted or what's going on here?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's like two elements going on here. I think there's definitely the, they want these things to happen. I think it's very valid. And I think being increasingly transparent is really important. I think the US has been very, very open about all of their policies in AI, and that's been a priority for them. So I think that is in alignment, but I think there's also, of course, a secondary benefit as well, right? If folks don't sign on, it looks like, it's very clear, why wouldn't XYZ state sign on? It seems very common sense. There is an element of that, but I don't think it outweighs the benefits of, again, being open and transparent about these issues, especially, again, as they are not necessarily military technologies, but commercial technologies that are being applied to military context. I think that's important. And I also think that from my understanding, I think, why we haven't heard so much about the process of, what states are being approached and how it's developing. I think there is quite a bit of, behind the scenes negotiation going on about what kind of, statements do we want to be and what kind of principles and how they're going to look like. And that's also probably why they haven't indicated what the process for edits and revisions would look like as well. I think that's definitely a part of it. There's a two-sided coin. Again, I'm more optimistic, but the cynical view is definitely valid. And I guess it remains to be seen by who signs on, which is why I'm excited to see what happens in the next few months if we get an update. And so it remains to be seen. But right now, I'm cautiously optimistic.
Yeah, fair enough. So drawing on some of the threads from your talk, as you point out, the technical work to make sure that these systems actually comply with international law sort of hasn't been done, right? Yeah. For a lot of things, it seems like the answer would be no. You probably couldn't build today a system that really would distinguish between, apply the various principles of international law and distinguish between combatants and civilians for one. And so I'm sort of wondering, so how should we see this given that, even the most advanced states can't really implement it, right? It's a lot easier to make an autonomous system that distinguishes between civilians and combatants 29% of the time as opposed to 100% of the time. Right. So when it comes to all these other states out there that may be signing on, when they're actually in conflict and there's a pressing need, we see it in Ukraine now. They're deploying all sorts of autonomous weapon systems without testing of them. So I guess the question is, how, if the US as the most resource state can't do it, how could we expect these other states possibly to do it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's going to be really interesting. And I think, I'm very curious about that question. And that's what I'm hoping to see for next, that states start to converse about this. From my understanding, I don't think that's in the formal conversations yet. I don't think that's being considered enough. And I completely agree with you. I think I think that's just in part due to how early these technologies are. It's really only since the invasion of Ukraine, I think people have seen the real tractable applications of this and seen AI is not, there's plenty of, DARPA and research funded projects like Alpha Dogfight that, they say they use AI in certain systems, but haven't been actually used or translated into real programs of record or actual capabilities, at least in the United States side. And so I think that's definitely going in the next step. And I'm worried that there are going to be growing pains there. I mean, as an interesting, I think, vignette, for example, that I think highlights this issue is Russia at some point, was using landmines and, cluster munitions, at some points in the war, and was saying, which are a violation of human rights treaties. And they had said that they had solved it by creating a new system that was enabled by AI in order to differentiate between the footsteps of a soldier and a farmer, as well as, whether it's a Ukrainian or a Russian combatant as well, using artificial intelligence somehow. And so it was actually a discerning munition. So, it didn't apply. Verifying that is almost impossible. It's pretty easy to see that it doesn't do that. But, when they make these claims, how do you go in and check? And so I think that's like an interesting kind of element of what's at play here. But definitely, I'm also kind of more cynical on that. I think it's a very hard technical problem. And I think we'll need to be really in close collaboration between the commercial and the government sectors, more than they are now in the United States, to see that really moving forward.
Great. Thanks for that. I want to transition for a moment and ask you about some other really interesting work that you've been doing. I know you've been involved in red teaming some frontier AI systems. And I think it would be really interesting to this group if you could tell us what you've been doing from a security point of view, how you've been red teaming it, what does that process look like, really anything about how that process looks like overall, and what it looked like for you and what your takeaways were. I think that'd be really useful.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. So I did some of the red teaming for OpenAI for the release of GPT-4. And I was looking at it from a security standpoint. And I think this is really kind of ties into something that I mentioned earlier, where I think it's really important for these actors that are creating uses of AI that, again, are not necessarily have a visual, a military application, but are starting to think about the potential security implications, or if there are any, of their systems, even if they're not necessarily inherently lethal. I think it's really, really important. And so that was the kind of framework and mindset that I was looking at these. I'm a little bit more, I would say, again, skeptical of, large language models and their disruptive kind of ability and security, especially. I think they're actually going to be more useful on balance rather than harmful. But I thought, why not be able to, probe the kind of limits and see if it is any more difficult, if it creates any novel risks or, exacerbates any existing risks in a novel way. So I kind of, again, it's a text model, so the limitations were there, but I tried to use it to see from a malicious actor standpoint is where I saw it being, the most helpful, I would say, from those, who seek to disrupt things for national security perspective. Or again, I mentioned that report that was done on the potential for, propaganda and influence operations, I think will be the most significant. In my experience, I did think it was, for someone who has zero knowledge about how to do, XYZ malicious act, I think having that as a starting off point would be helpful. But there has not been any extensive research on how much more helpful it is or how much quicker it is than, say, using traditional methods or, avenues such as Google or things like that. So I'm curious to see the research on that moving forward. I'm also curious to see if anyone is doing research on, if those who are creating kind of I think a lot of the disinformation and misinformation come from a very small number of individuals. So I'm curious to see if anyone is tracking whether or not they're starting to use more AI generated content to, as a mass multiplier effect. But those are the kinds of questions that I was kind of testing for. Again, I was not very convinced of its disruptive implications. I think in the system card, they mentioned the ability for proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and things, but none of the information that provides, again, is not, it doesn't have access to any privileged information or anything that, you can't access already. And I think even on the reverse side, those systems are prone to hallucinate. And so I think, might even be counterproductive in those respects.
Well, that's it's a little bit comforting. So I'm just curious to ask you, like, what was the worst thing? Like you said, you weren't that concerned, but was there what was the worst thing that you found that you thought, okay, at least something?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was pretty, I think as someone with I'm doing some computer science, I have some computer science background, but without much, it was able to, look at a specific website and tell me like where I could identify certain, certain risks or, potential potential vulnerabilities of, where to kind of start looking. And I could, it taught me how to look at, the web page information, how to see what plugins it's using, and then generated code on how I would test that. So that was pretty novel to me. And I think able to, give it in a step-by-step kind of instruction manual on how to combine with code, I think was a little bit novel. But again, I don't think that was the most risky. And I still think, if someone is going to do that, they already have the skills needed to do that. So
yeah,
I guess it's good if you're just starting out.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So in that sense, it lowers the bar of expertise, I guess.
Yeah,
So
definitely lowers barriers to entry at that very initial level, I think.
yeah, exactly. So what did this process look like? How did you sort of report things to them? Were you, was there like a conference? Did you get together? Do you have a sense of how many people like you there were and who was doing this and how it all worked?
Yeah, no, it was very independent, I think, for, privacy concerns and, and people not wanting to be influenced. So it was just an individual exercise for me and, the other folks I only knew who else participated looking at the system card and who chose to be, remain not anonymous. And so, but it was very hands off. I was given access to the models and was able to, play around and compare different versions, and then was, just expected to kind of input my findings and my prompts in a Google Sheets and then kind of summarize and return, what I found and what my assessments were given my background. So it was, again, very hands off and very open. So very much just like the conversation we have now. And I'm sure if you, many of you have played with ChatGPT or GPT-4, it's very similar to you just naturally using the system, and probing and seeing how you can break it. And, there's been a very interesting examples on Twitter of people getting around certain safety mechanisms and whatnot. So.
Great. Well, Lauren, thank you so much again. I think this will end the public portion of the talk, and we'll throw it open to the floor for questions that people have.